Welcome, ladies and gentlemen. Namaste, assalamu alaikum, good evening or good morning to all of you, depending on the time zone in which you live, because there are always people in this meeting from all over the world. I am Shakira Mohammed, a teacher for the past 15 years, and this is the 147th edition of our Zoom public meeting. We wish to sincerely thank all those who have contributed in whatever way to the success of this ongoing Pan-Indo-Caribbean and Pan-Indian Diaspora global project. So for 146 unbroken continuous weeks, we have been here every single Sunday. In the past 3 years and 1 week, we have featured 598 presenters from all parts of the world speaking on 146 topics. Ladies and gentlemen, this is a weekly forum being hosted by the Indo-Caribbean Cultural Center, a legally registered research and publishing company operating since 2010. And like today, we often partner with the Amina Ghafoor Institute for the study of indentureship and its legacies, led by Professor David Davidine. In order to continue this weekly program and to make it bigger and better, we are asking you to kindly give us your suggestions as well as donations, and you can contact Dr. Kumar Mahabir for further details. So, ladies and gentlemen, the Muslim community is observing the holy month of Ramadan. Hindus are celebrating the beginning of the Hindu New Year, and Christians are observing the period of Lent. Aren't we blessed as a human race for celebrations such as these? Ladies and gentlemen, our moderator this evening or tonight is Shalama Mohammed, the co-director of the Zoom platform, who is a business teacher and researcher from Trinidad and Tobago. She obtained her master's degree in business psychology from Franklin University in the USA. Shalama, welcome. Please take over from here.
Thank you very much, Shakir. Assalamu alaikum, everyone. Namaste, and a very warm welcome to you all. Ladies and gentlemen, I want to thank you for being here with us at this time. So this public meeting will take the usual form of a panel presentation, followed by questions and answers. Please forgive me, the dogs are fighting. So to avoid trolls invading our program, our IT manager, Robin Ramsing, has muted everyone. Speakers are advised not to admit anyone, not to unmute anyone, and please do not allow anyone to share your screen. Thank you. This virtual event should not exceed 2 hours. And today we are talking about alcoholism, India, indentureship, and the Indian diaspora. Why? Alcoholism was a prevalent problem during Indian indentureship between 1834 and 1917, when Indian laborers were brought to various British, French, and Dutch colonies. The harsh living and working conditions, coupled with the trauma of a deceitful migration scheme, led many Indians to seek solace in alcohol. The colonial authorities exacerbated the problem by providing cheap liquor and failing to regulate the sale of alcohol. With consistent migration and remigration occurring, the stress of acculturation, discrimination, and social isolation can lead to excessive drinking, which can have negative consequences on both physical and mental health. In this forum, we wish to create greater awareness about the dangers of alcohol and help promote healthier lifestyles. Of importance to us too is to determine to what extent is alcoholism a problem in the Indian diaspora today, and what can we do about it. So let me introduce our first speaker. And this is Professor Verena Pandriang Raghubar of Mauritius. She's an associate professor in economics at the University of Mauritius. Her specialization is in economics, labor, poverty, and gender issues. Welcome, Professor. You can go ahead and speak for 20 minutes.
Okay, thank you. Good afternoon and good morning to everyone, depending on your time zone there. Thank you, Salima. I will now share my screen.
Sure.
I hope you can see that.
Yes, we are seeing it.
All right, good. So as rightly mentioned, I'm an economist, and this is a study that we've done in Mauritius and Rodrigues. We have been looking at substance use among young adults in Mauritius and Rodrigues. We are located in the Indian Ocean, and both Mauritius and Rodrigues are small islands. So what we did is looking at the socioeconomic cost of substance use among young adults in both Mauritius and Rodrigues.
Okay, Professor Baragbar, would you mind just speaking a little bit louder, please?
Okay, all right, I'll do that.
Thank you.
Can you hear me now?
A little louder. Maybe you have to turn up your
Is it
volume.
better now? Is it better?
Just speak louder. Maybe that might help.
All right, so I'll try to speak louder. Is it better now?
Yeah, a little better.
Yes,
Yeah.
thank you.
Okay. All right, so that was basically a study which we worked together with other colleagues from the social department, because we adopted a socioeconomic course to measuring the impact of substance use among young adults in Mauritius. So basically, what we did in that study is trying to assess the extent to which tobacco smoking and alcohol use represent a gateway to illicit drug among young islanders, that is in both Mauritius and Rodrigues. And then we assessed the prevalence of drug use among young adults aged between 18 and 35 years in both Mauritius and Rodrigues, and then analyzed the impact on families, on parents, especially what happened at school also. So we've been looking at the prevalence, but also at the impact of drug consumption on family life. Then what we did next is trying to undertake a socioeconomic analysis of the cost of drug use among young adults to the state. So how much government is spending on that particular issue. We all know that no society is safe from drugs, especially due to exposure and accessibility, especially to young adults. Mauritius and Rodrigues are not spared from this drug scourge. Over the last year, substance use in Mauritius, in particular the use of synthetic drugs, has been escalating. Despite being very small island and remote, drug consumption and trafficking are on the roof of socioeconomic problems in Mauritius and Rodrigues. In fact, Mauritius, we've been seeing in the last decade an increase in the number of drug users and having an important impact on the society as well as the economy. If we look at the data, we did the study prior to COVID-19, and we have been assessing in that case the number of deaths by substance use in Mauritius. And we've seen that in this case, you can see from the chart that there has been an increase in the total number of deaths over the years. And what we did is try to compare total death from alcohol use, also total death from drug use, and total death from tobacco. So basically, there has been a rising trend from all the three substance use. Now, we all know from that perspective of high consumption, there are a number of social impacts in terms of crimes, offenses being there, and we see that there has been an increase over the years from 2007 to 2018, and the crime by drug offenders as a percentage of total crimes reported has also been rising. Yeah, so it's not only the number of people being affected, but also the number of crimes. So there are impacts there that we need to capture. So since the study focuses on young adults specifically, so we've been looking at the rate of crimes and offenses caused by juvenile who use drugs. And you can see from the data there there has been a rise. And of course, like I just mentioned, we did that prior to COVID-19, but we've seen there has been other like studies, qualitative studies mainly, saying that this has goes up also during the lockdowns and during the COVID-19 pandemic. So offenses, crimes, and number of people affected by drugs have been on the rise in Mauritius in particular. Now, what type of drugs? We'll see that which has been mainly affecting the Mauritian society has been the use of synthetic drugs recently. So the number of offenses by drug type, if I compare 2014, it was mainly from cannabis. But increasingly in 2018, we've seen that synthetic, because being cheaper and easily accessible to young people in particular, the number of offenses resulting from synthetic drugs has increased. So Mauritius has a drug policy framework and action plan, and Mauritius has ratified a number of international drug control conventions. There are a number of policies, legislations, and there has been a strong commitment to address the drug problem holistically. Yeah, so Mauritius, as I said, has a number of programs being there to cater for people affected by alcohol, tobacco smoking, and drug use. And we've seen that despite this particular problem, drug use is still a very important issue, having both economic and social implications on the country. So what I did is basically looking at the different programs there. There are a public awareness program, workplace drug prevention campaign, community drug prevention program, prevention against drug use among children in particular, and you have a number of other therapies, rehabilitation services being provided. Now, what we did in that study, which was funded by the University of Mauritius, is trying to do a survey, because there has been other surveys being done before to capture the impact of drug use in Mauritius. But this has been kind of I would say, different, not linking alcohol use, tobacco use, etc. Right? So what we wanted to do in that study is basically adopt a holistic framework, taking on board individual characteristics, relationship within the household, the family, the community, and the society. So having a holistic approach to model the use of different substances, illicit or licit use of substances. So we look at the individual characteristics, and one characteristics was in terms of age, gender. We also look at different aspects in terms of the health of the individual, the learning ability of the individual, whether that person is employed or not. So also the other one in terms of the household was family disruptions, low education level of parents, low socio-economic status of the household, poor performance at school, in that case, whether the family is consuming a drug or alcohol or smoking at home, and other social and health issues which can be present in the family. The community aspect has been captured in terms of availability of drugs, cheap price, easy access, youth gangs in the neighborhood, peer culture and pressure, lack of leisure activities and sport facilities, insufficient infrastructure for the satisfaction of needs and interests of young people. And on a global macro perspective, we talk about the society. Yeah. So what in terms of poverty, income inequality, the institutions which are there, lack of good governance, etc. So we built basically a conceptual framework trying to take on board all these different dimensions. So as mentioned, this study has both a quantitative and qualitative part of it, but I would be presenting more on the quantitative part, and where we had a survey of 400 young adults aged between 18 and 35 years old in Mauritius and Rodrigues, 400 for Mauritius and 250 for Rodrigues. We also had a number of consultative meetings with different stakeholders, families, social workers, etc. So being an economist, what we did within the Department of Economics and Statistics is trying to measure that prevalence. So we have a number of indicators within the survey. We design a questionnaire and we try to look at the use of cigarettes, use of alcoholic drinks, and also use of drugs among young adults. So we look at amount spent, the frequency of use, the average expenditure, and also where did they consume these substances, the average spent per week or per month. So we had a number of indicators in order to ensure the robustness of our results. So we did some kind of analysis to see whether substance use is related to age, gender, family size, marital status, education, work status, the household income, parents' work status, parents using these substances, internet access, and mobile phone, because during the survey, it was very easy for young people to get access to different types of substances, especially synthetic drugs, through the network, on social media, on the internet. So what the survey tells us, when we look first on the prevalence of tobacco and alcohol use, we saw that around, I would say 45% of young Mauritian adults use cigarettes in the sample, and around 44%, let's say, consume alcoholic drinks. Young adults aged between 21 and 25 were more likely to smoke and drink compared to youngsters in other age groups. In the survey, young men have higher rates of cigarette and alcohol use compared to female counterparts. So we could basically make that difference across gender. Around 64% of those who use cigarettes and 80% of those who consume alcohol have parents or family members consuming at least one substance. So that was connected also to the family environment. A high percentage, we will say around 95.5% of those who smoke have friends who also smoke or use drugs or consume alcoholic drinks. So peer pressure is another, I would say, factor there encouraging tobacco and alcohol use. 23% stated that on average, they smoke at least 7 cigarettes per day, followed by around 8% indicating that they use 1 to 3 cigarettes per day. The majority in that sample, 43%, reported that they also consume between 1 to 3 alcoholic drinks per week. And of course, the percentage gets down when the intensity of drinks increases on a weekly basis. The main reason for using substances is curiosity in that survey. 32% were curious to know how it feels, and 30% was proposed a cigarette or drink by friends. 12% wanted to feel grown up, and 10% reported that they started to smoke or drink alcohol because their parents were doing so at home. Now, what we did is we analyzed the alcohol and cigarette use in the sample, then we come to illicit drug use. And we could see in the sample that there was a prevalence rate of around 11.5% among young adults in Mauritius. And for Rodrigues, having a smaller population, the prevalence rate stood at 8.1%. In fact, globally, 5.4% of the population aged between 15 and 64 use drugs, which is nearly 1 in every 19 people. That percentage for Mauritius, a prevalence rate of 11.5%, is very is a concern for a small island of Mauritius, and especially it is among young adults. The profile of the young Mauritian who uses drug is a male, I would say, because we've seen that difference across gender, age between 21 and 30 years old, single mainly, have at least passed their higher school certificate, that is their A-level, and having relatives and friends using drugs. In fact, for Rodrigues, they tend to be age between 18 and 20. It's single male again, but the level of education is much lower, right? So in Rodrigues, it tends to be among younger people, but also less educated ones. The most common drugs in Mauritius, we've seen that 65% use cannabis, 25% synthetic drugs, and 7% use heroin. But there are people there using a mixture of all these drugs. The most consumed drugs in Rodrigues is cannabis. So heroin is starting to get also into the Rodriguan society. What we did, therefore, we look at the different access and consumption of drugs among young adults in Mauritius. And we talk about the frequency of drug intake, also how do they consume it. We've seen smoking, inhaling, and injection of drugs, but smoking is the most common one. Sharing of drugs is another issue, with the high percentage sharing drugs, and also having drugs with friends and also with family. We've seen that in the sample, that is around 48.4% use drugs at home or at a friend's place, or Mauritius, being an island, you have a percentage of these young adults using drugs on the beach, also in school and university premises. In fact, we've seen recently there has been an increase in the percentage of young people using drugs on educational premises. So we've seen that around 54% take any drugs before midday, 35% take any drug as soon as they wake up, and though around 55% have tried to stop using drugs, the majority have been very unsuccessful in quitting drugs. They couldn't quit because of friend pressure or because of other social problems in their life. So we've seen that those young drug users, they have encountered family problems, face health issues, steal money from parents, get into fights with friends. So there has been a number of impacts, not only on the family, on parents, on friends, but also on the society at university, at work, or whether they've lost their jobs, etc., or they've just quit university or colleges, right? What we've seen also is the first time they've used drug is the highest percentage has been between 16 and 20. But you can see that even 36% have started at an early age, 10 to 15 years. So the persistence in drug use, because we've seen that many could not quit, has been, for many, they feel fun, feel more relaxed, they try to escape problem, they want to be accepted socially, but they couldn't do away without illicit drugs, but also to reduce psychological pain, stress, sadness, fear, and shame. So yeah, we've been looking at a number for Rodrigues, we've done similar analysis, and we've seen that they consume at an early age, how much they spend. Again, we also found that curiosity and desire to know how it feels, and also peer pressure, are among the top, I would say, the top reasons why is it that consumption of drugs, access and consumption of drugs tend to be high, and why young adults have been consuming drugs, right? So another one is continued consumption of drugs for fun and to feel more relaxed. And these are similar to that of the results that we got for Mauritius. So what we did next is try to use the econometric model. I didn't present all the results there, but basically try to see whether the substances are linked. So the findings reveal that among young people who smoke or drink alcohol, there is a greater probability of them using drugs. All three substances tend to be highly linked. Peer pressure remains a major pull factor in the world of substances, together with the wish to know how it feels and being curious about it, to be socially acceptable among friends, to be part of a community. Drugs are consumed more among young adults if their parents do so, if their friends do so. We haven't seen any difference in terms of consumption of substances being linked to education or different age brackets. So parental use of different substances and peer pressure are seen to be important attributes to the prevalence of substances among young islanders, that is in both Mauritius and Rodrigues. Now, when we tried, this was in terms of... Yeah.
Professor, hi. Would you mind making your closing comments, please?
Yeah. So
Thank you.
We estimate, thank you. So we estimated that the impact on the Mauritian economy is around 0.1%, which is nearly to what other countries have found. Larger countries have a percentage of 0.2 or 0.4. So in terms of policy implication, greater awareness, support to drug users, but parental guidance as well. The media has a role to play, but also other relevant stakeholders working together, NGOs, government, private sector, etc., to be able to provide that support and to try to deal with the problem. We think about having awareness campaigns, but also being accompanied by sports activities. So from the report, we come forward with a number of policy recommendations. So I hope I didn't take more time. Thank you for your attention. If you need, you would want to have a copy of the report, I'll be more than willing to share. You can just drop me an email on the email address there. So thanks a lot, and thanks for inviting me.
Thank you so much. That was a very insightful presentation. There are some questions in the chat for you. I know that it's 11 p.m. right now in Mauritius. Is it 11 or beyond?
Beyond, 11:30.
Beyond, yeah. So thank you very much. Please just review the chat, and if it is that you can't stay with us to the end, we would really appreciate it. But we also understand that it's very late, and if it is that you have to go, please just give us a comment in the chat.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for your time. Thank you so much for your time and sharing all the knowledge that you have.
Thank you.
So, ladies and gentlemen, that was Professor Verena from Mauritius, and we now move on to our second speaker from South Africa. This is Dr. Varoshni Nadesan. She's a qualified social worker, senior lecturer, and postgraduate supervisor at the University of Johannesburg. She is active in creating more awareness on the dangers of alcoholism and substance dependency. Welcome, Dr. Nadesan. You have 20 minutes. Go ahead, please.
Thank you very much, and thank you to the organizers for inviting me. It's also very pleasing to see so many from South Africa attending today's session. Now, my presentation is extremely different from what was presented by Professor Raghuveer. I thoroughly enjoyed the presentation, listening to the statistics, but mine is more of a personal reflections, because I'm just looking at the brief that was given, looking at the Indian diaspora and indentureship. So good evening from a South African of Indian descent. My presentation today is my personal reflections. I've worked a lot in the field of alcoholism, and I'm presenting to you my own views on this. I'm a South African born at a state hospital in Durban in the mid-60s. And just a little bit of background about myself. My parents, who are now 85 and 78, were also born in South Africa. So what then makes me claim my Indian heritage? Well, my paternal grandparents arrived in South Africa in the early 1900s. So if you look on the screen, you'd see the trip that was made from India to South Africa. And according to records obtained from the special collections at the Durban Documentation Center, my grandparents actually originated from the east coast town of Visakhapatnam, which is Visakh, somewhere here in India. And they then arrived in South Africa at the age of 9 and 4 years old too, and they were booked to work in the sugar mills. So it's both my grandparents on the paternal and maternal side. So as far as I know, I have a keen eye for this. This is my family tree, where my grandparents were born in Visakhapatnam. My parents were born in South Africa, and I'm born in South Africa. So I consider myself a South African of Indian descent. When I look at the South Africans that have arrived in South Africa in the 1860s, there was a huge influx of South Africans. In fact, around 150 about 150,000 Indian nationals were shipped across to South Africa in the 1860s, between 1860 and 1917. And today we have about 1.5 million South African as Indians in South Africa. It's increased tenfold. But there's no studies that I'm aware of that we're looking at particularly the South Africans of Indian descent, or South Africans in the Indian diaspora in South Africa in terms of their alcoholism. Were any of the drinkers alcoholics? Well, it would depend on when and at what time you refer to as one being an alcoholic. One must look at cultural issues, indigenous practices, and that's something we're very, very big on in South Africa, the indigenous understanding of what alcohol is in communities. But what we do know is that when our ancestors of Indian heritage came to South Africa, they built schools to educate their families, thus creating a strong educational system second to none. They built religious institutions where their families could pray. And what is astounding for me today on this platform is to look at the names on the screen and realize that we all have the same ancestry. And for me, that's just amazing. One of the things we have in South Africa, and I think throughout the world that hasn't been identified as this, is the system of Ubuntu, where it takes a village to raise the child. And these were adages that were practiced even then. So you would find that in our history, when we look at it, for instance, my maternal great-grandmother became widowed shortly after she landed in South Africa. And this meant she had to leave her young child and work in the sugarcane fields, often working as hard as the men out there. The issue of alcohol, yes, I believe it was touched as well. Whether she was an alcoholic, I do not know, and I don't think that is documented. One of the key issues I think it's very important to share here today is the segregated policies of our country in South Africa. So from what we've been told from our history, on the 6th of April, 1652, we had Jan van Riebeeck arrive in this country, and he had then come in from the Dutch, with the Dutch East India Company, and that's when we hear when the white man took over the country. Yes, this was the start of the period of apartheid, and the rest is history. So yes, South Africa was colonized not just by the Dutch, but also by the British. And come to think of it, with the 150,000 that came in from India by the Indians as well. But what then did the apartheid system do was that when the Indian indentured laborers arrived, many took on the roles of slave to master. And I raise this because of the payment issue from the master-servant work. Often payment was in the form of alcohol, whether imported or home-brewed. Alcohol was and is still used as a payment for labor in many of our societies. And this payment system developed into a norm, and thus maybe the dependency has increased. So South African society was separated by racial classification in order for, with the following hierarchy, you had the whites and the non-whites. And the non-whites were anyone that was not European. So the Indians and the blacks or Africans and the coloreds, or so-called mixture of the races, were relegated to second-class citizens, subject to the Group Areas Act, where specific races could only live in specific areas. And so it is documented that most of the ships from India landed in the port of Natal, now known as Durban. Durban has two large sprawling townships that was developed for the Indian population, namely Chatsworth and later Phoenix. And I was raised in Chatsworth, where I lived and worked for 34 years. Is alcohol rife in the Indian townships of Chatsworth and Phoenix? What are the telltale signs of abuse? Well, in my ramblings at the time, I wrote an opinion piece that I would like to share with you. This piece was printed in the national newspaper called The Post in March 2015 and the Phoenix Tabloid a few years later. And both publications have a large Indian readership. And this publication, I was told, was also used as a case study for comprehension at local primary schools in Chatsworth at the time. And it goes like this. It was published on 26th of January 2015. I will share with you bits of it on the screen as I read through it. And it's called Alcoholism, a Bittersweet Blame. So Chatsworth and Phoenix, with its growing and diverse population, massive developments and industrialized sectors, has not been immune to the impact of alcohol on its residents. Having been part of our historic community, one is astonished at the transition in our society from a previously quiet neighborhood where families socialized openly and a time when alcohol was the source of enjoyment of largely senior men in the family, to the boisterous gatherings of our families and friends now, where the alcohol is the source of food for men and women, young and old alike. There's no doubt that any gathering, at any of these gatherings, there'll be a table or two set aside for the taste of the connoisseurs, as well as the up-and-coming drinkers, or the youngsters as they are called. Crates of Black Label, bottles of Johnny Walker from red, blue to Black Labels, KWV, vodka, the famous Strawberry Lips, to name a conservative few. We have emerged as a society where there is no life without the presence of the booze, where we turned a blind eye to the car boot, or is it the car booze party, at a wedding, when some of the bored men disappear from their seats, only to return grinning later, in time to wish the bridal couple, where we proudly show off our custom-made bars and openly invite our young children and adults to take part in our alcohol displays. Where did we go wrong as a society? Or is it wrong to indulge in a drink or two at the end of a long workday? I don't think for a moment that one can be judgmental in assuming that there is someone or something to be blamed. I also don't assume that alcohol is the source of all evils either. And having been trained as a social worker, I elected to work in the welfare sector in Chatsworth, a primarily Indian township. For over 20 years, I regularly encountered mothers who cried bitterly at our offices when there was no money left to pay bills at the end of the month. Once the local shebeens were done with the father's hard-earned salary. Shebeens are another word for tavern or home bars. This was an issue that became increasingly worse when the breadwinner's bonus or state pension was taxed with interest for non-payment of that shebeen account. And as a social worker, I was faced with the issue of abandoned infants and little children whose parents were happily fraternizing at the local tavern until late in the night, oblivious to their offspring back home. Little children being made to ask for handouts door to door or beg at the local traffic lights to help their parents meet family expenses. Children who had to earn money by whatever means to buy school stationery and uniforms, or face the wrath of the teachers who ridicule from their peers. Children whose homes were destroyed by the impact of drunken parents, by the abusive relationships and the possible resultant poverty when incomes were lost. not to mention those that face the wrath of the law from driving under the influence of alcohol. And we have a high prevalence of these kinds of offenses in South Africa. The list is endless. Was it just the presence of the bottle that resulted in broken marriages and dysfunctional homes? Well, as a social worker, I was faced with the reality of the system. Is it not the fault of the children? Or is that their circumstances were beyond control, that they had to assume the role of breadwinners? And sadly, those that bore and still bear the brunt of the system are our little ones who barely have a voice before the court when they are the ones removed from their cozy homes to live with strangers in strange, unfamiliar, sterile environments, losing all sense of direction in their lives. Whilst the sources of the problem remains, and then a few days later, we would encounter those same mums who this time transfer blame on their children for being unsupportive when dad was trying his best to feed his growing family despite his alcohol addiction. We are a society that has changed in its values and the way we value ourselves. And we need some.
Professor Nadesan, your sound is gone.
It says that the host has muted me.
Okay, you're back now.
Okay, thank you. All right. So we are a society that has changed its values and the way we value ourselves, and we need to blame something. So why not blame the bottle? It cannot talk back, but it holds hidden control over our lives. It is sweet when it makes us feel good and warm inside, and it's bitter when we have to deal with its effect on our lives and our inability to control ourselves when the bottle beckons. But the people of Chatsworth, where I was raised, have not been complacent in dealing with this intruder. And Chatsworth has one of the largest networks of AA groups, for instance, Alcoholics Anonymous in the country. A fair indication of not just recognizing that this is a problem, but obviously showing concerted efforts made by those in the know to help and support one another to overcome this disease. And so I go on in the article with providing resources for the help seeking. But I want to close this presentation with two anecdotes. And the first is a personal one where I had attended one of the AA meetings with a family friend in Chatsworth. And at the end of the AA meeting, the family friend drops me off and says, you know what, I really, really now need a drink. And off he went to the local bar. And that was really amusing. But I think another anecdote that comes in, and this one I really don't know the source of, but the Indians arrived in South Africa to work on the sugarcane plantations. That's a fact. They came to cut the grass and to smoke the cane. Now they smoke the grass and they drink the cane. Thank you very much. Thanks for listening.
Very interesting one there. Thank you so much. Quite a revealing presentation, I have to say, and I really appreciate you sharing your private story, your private history with us as well. Thank you. So, ladies and gentlemen, there we have Professor Nadesan from South Africa, and we stay with South Africa with our third speaker. This is Dr. Lochan Naidu. He's a prominent addiction specialist who founded the Julo, I hope I pronounced this correctly, Julo Center for Advanced Addiction Recovery in 1995. It is one of South Africa's leading addiction treatment facilities. Welcome, Dr. Naidu. You have 20 minutes. Go ahead, please.
Thank you, ma'am. I hope you can see my screen.
Yes, we're seeing it clearly.
Yes, thank you very much. And it's a pleasure to actually share with the diaspora. It's not often that we have this opportunity. Thank you also to the ICC for the invitation. I assumed, I think quite correctly, that my colleagues coming from social and from economics would touch on the history of indentureship, so I'm not going to talk too much of that. I rather just want to concentrate on my experience in addiction. So alcohol use disorder. Basically, this is the definition we're looking at from National Institute on Alcoholism, and describing it as a chronic relapse in brain disease. I think this is very important. Chronic relapse in brain disease. And that's a loaded statement. And when we talk about chronic, we need to think about other conditions like diabetes, hypertension, cancer, etc. And you notice when people are talking about alcoholism, which is not a medical term, but it's a colloquial term, and I think everyone's got various definitions on how they exclude themselves from the diagnosis. But alcohol use disorder is characterized by compulsive use, loss of control over alcohol intake, and a negative emotional state, even when not using alcohol. So when you talk about what comes first, is there someone who's more prone to being dependent on alcohol, or is the alcohol that makes someone dependent? I think that's an argument that we might need to look at and touch on as we go through the presentation. So it involves physical dependence and tolerance. And what is physical dependence and tolerance? So I'm just going to colloquially say that dependence means I must have, and tolerance means I need greater amounts to produce the same effect, or I get less of an effect with the same amount. So whenever you move to dependence and tolerance, then we're talking about alcohol use disorders. Then there's the other component. Is alcohol itself innocent, even if you don't have a use disorder? I think that needs to also be looked at. So alcoholism is a significant problem in the Indian community abroad, and there's a wide variation. And in India, they talk about, India itself is such a diverse society, but they're talking about an average of 1 in 12 people with an alcohol use disorder. And WHO cites about 3 million deaths annually and contributes to about 200 diseases and injury-related conditions. Alcoholism is the 7th leading cause of disability and premature death in the world. And the Indian diaspora may encounter unique cultural and social pressures contributing to this onset. I need to get this off there. Yeah. So what are there's talk of the dopamine 2 receptor gene among many other genes, making people of Indian descent more vulnerable to alcohol dependency. Now, when we're talking about alcohol dependency and alcohol itself, I'm sure many of you in the audience will agree that there are some people who can have 1 or 2 drinks and stop, and some people who can't. And that doesn't make one person stronger than the other. When you look at the disease model or the medical model, we start saying that one person has got more vulnerability, or maybe there's a genetic predisposition, or maybe there are issues like neurological immaturity due to adverse childhood experiences. I will touch that a little later also. So there is this argument of nature versus nurture. So it doesn't mean if you have a gene that may be associated with alcohol or addiction conditions that you will necessarily use chemicals. And at the same time, it doesn't mean that if you don't have the gene and you grow up in an environment where alcohol use or misuse is normal, that you won't become dependent. So the other words that we need to encounter are, when we look at treatment, is substance abuse. Substance use disorder now is the new classification. But in the old days or years before, we should talk about substance abuse, and we talk about addiction disorders. And people with addiction disorders generally would be people with a genetic predisposition, and substance abuse would be more familial learned behavior. And it's important to make that distinction and to look at how we make that distinction, because treatment may be a little different. For example, in people with substance use disorders, it's easier and more amenable to counseling. Yet patients with addictive disorders generally show certain characteristics. One of them is they have an above average intellect. Number 2, they tend to be more perfectionistic, which means they're more controlling. They also have a problem with insight. They have a learning disorder. So what we have now, we have patients with above average intellect, but problems with prefrontal cortical areas, which is in charge of things like personality, judgment, motivation, cognition, processing of information, etc. So different areas of the brain are predominant in these conditions. So treating people with addiction disorders would mean also realigning their neurological systems and to be able to reset the hypothalamus pituitary axis, which means their stress responses. So it's not just simply counseling. And the point I make here is that there tends to be in the literature very high relapse rates. And sometimes I wonder, does a patient qualify as a person who's relapsed, who may just be a person who hasn't made full recovery and is deemed to be relapsed? And this is dangerous because sometimes the patient is going to repeated treatment and they so-called relapse or don't make good recovery, they tend to lose hope, and that may increase the incidence of suicide in these patients. So let's, so I'm not going to talk too much about this, but I think our speakers have alluded to this area, but this is the global community of Indian origin that have migrated from the ancestral homeland. So the sizable populations are in the United States, Canada, United Kingdom, South Africa, Australia, and Southeast Asia. So what are the challenges? Well, identity crisis is really an issue. So, for example, am I a South African? Am I an Indian? Am I a South African of Indian origin? Am I an African? And so there's a lot of confusion, and each country has got their own idea. And there's the feeling of disconnectedness from their roots. So you have people who have issues with this disconnect, and they adopt in a new culture. So there's a mix within the culture, the languages, and the values of their host country. So you have this hybrid kind of societies start developing, and especially first generation, second generation, third generation. And as you move on the generations, you tend to find more of a Western kind of slant in, for example, the South African environment. Religiously, we also see a lot of the Hindu community was very, very, by far the largest component of the Indian diaspora in South Africa. But there's a large movement to move into conversion to Christianity. So you'd find a lot of couples married who may be mixed religion, etc. And the children really may get confused at times. So they also face discrimination and racism, language barriers, different social and cultural norms. But there are pros, of course. So being in the diaspora would provide unique experiences and opportunities. They broaden one's perspective, creates new connections, and provides diverse career options. So there are some pros to this. So what are the cultural factors contributing to alcoholism in the diaspora? Well, alcohol is important in Indian culture. I mean, we know that there's always alcohol present in some traditions, some ceremonies. It's also a social lubricant to advance professionally and personally. It's varied, and of course, we do also know that in some subsets of the community, it's taboo. There's a lot of stigma surrounding substance abuse and seeking treatment. There's also stigma in seeking treatment, which means as though, I'm supposed to handle this on my own. I'm not supposed to look for help. And generally, you would also find families doing that, being able to not accept outside help. And this stems from belief that people view addiction as a moral failing or a sign of weakness rather than a medical condition. And many feel shame and guilt. And what is shame? Shame, something wrong with me. So what would you do? I would go and train. So shame ought to train us. But people are so ashamed of feeling shame, If you just listen to that, it's a problem. Shame is a problem, but it's so therapeutic to have shame. And people sometimes rather think that it's guilt, which means I would go for treatment and I would serve my time and then I'm okay. and there's no further responsibility to manage in this chronic condition. So I would like people to move away from guilt. I don't think it's anyone's fault. There may be circumstances, yes, that may lead to predispose people to get in this condition. But really, I'd rather you move from guilt to shame, you know, and shame says there's something wrong with me. I really need to get and look at what it is. And there's a sense of isolation also with stigma and prevents seeking help, the lack of understanding and knowledge about addiction and mental health diseases. And this leads to misinformation and stereotypes, and that perpetuates the stigma. Men consume more and engage in heavy drinking. Women may be more susceptible to negative effects of alcohol. We must remember that in women, the enzyme alcohol dehydrogenase is not as active in the stomach of women. So alcohol is not metabolized before it's absorbed. So it have direct effect on the brain, direct effect on the liver. So women would tend to develop more damage compared to men. However, men's heavy drinking makes up for that difference. So young people engage in a lot of risky behavior, such as binge drinking. Older people are more vulnerable to the harmful effects of alcohol due to age-related changes in the body. And there's often a correlation between lower socioeconomic status and higher rates of alcohol consumption and alcohol-related problems due to stress, lack of access to health care and support services, and greater exposure to social and environmental risk factors. So what are the social factors contributing to alcoholism? Influence of peer pressure, I think we've alluded to that. It's kind of, it's compounded by a cultural expectation, such as hospitality and generosity, which can lead to excessive drinking in order to demonstrate social status or to avoid offending others. So many may also use alcohol as a coping mechanism. People have problems balancing multiple identities and cultural expectations, adapting to a new environment and facing discrimination and prejudice, and may lead to mental health problems, like depression and anxiety, which can in turn lead to alcohol abuse as a coping mechanism. Availability and affordability, I think we heard in the first presentation, is really very important. You know, in the diaspora, you find out the South African situation, access is really almost every street in every township as a tavern. It's very hard in a lot of townships to get out of your front door and not see a tavern or two before you leave the street. And this leads to easy to develop problematic drinking habits, especially combined with stress, depression, and social pressures. Cultures where alcohol is less socially acceptable, these people may be more susceptible. So when they have access to alcohol availability, they tend to abuse the alcohol. So what are the health consequences? There's liver damage that can lead to inflammation of the liver and eventually cirrhosis or liver failure. It's not a nice way to die. I'm probably prejudiced because I'm working in a treatment facility. My facility is the first private facility for people of color in South Africa, and established in 1994, 1995. And over the years, we've seen such a deterioration. And we actually basically see a reflection of society and reflection of how society is slowly losing its humanity. You know, people don't know how to feel. When you ask them anything, they only talk about what they think. They don't know how to feel. And feelings are something that people want to avoid all the time. So cardiovascular diseases, there's an increase in heart disease, strokes, cardiovascular conditions like alcohol damage to the heart muscle, an increased risk of cancer, liver cancer, breast cancer, throat cancer. Nutritional deficiencies. I mean, for example, a lot of people think that if I drink, I must eat and I will get my thiamine. But what people don't know that when you take in alcohol in your body and you eat or take a thiamine supplement, alcohol blocks the absorption of this. So diabetes, the risk of type 2 diabetes is increased for people at risk, which is like people with obesity, etc. But also pancreatitis, recurrent pancreatitis due to alcoholism burns out the cells that produce insulin, and these people become insulin dependent diabetics. Then there's mental health problems ranging from depression, anxiety, increased suicide, but also a lot of neurological damage and fine neurological damage leading to learning disorders. For example, people who have difficulty in managing their mood, people who have a problem with short-term memory. People's long-term memory is generally intact. Short-term memory is really a problem. Mood fluctuation is a problem. Motivation is a problem. Judgment is a problem. And when the areas in the brain in charge of judgment are affected, it's not only judgment around what you drink or what you drug, but it's judgment in generally who you marry and how you invest, and judgment in general in your life, making poor choices. And of course, there's an increase in sexually transmitted illnesses and problems with the digestive system, like ulcers, etc. I want to note at this moment also that for women tend to be more prone to cancer of the colon, especially if they grew up in homes where there's been alcohol abuse and marry 80% of people who grow up, children who grow up in homes where there's alcohol abuse tend to gravitate towards men and relationships where men are using substances or very controlling. So mental health is depression, anxiety, insomnia, post-traumatic stress disorder, which may be a problem with the diaspora because of the migration issues, etc., can be exacerbated. Suicidal ideation, suicidal behavior, psychosis, hallucinations, etc., and delusions are very common in patients with alcohol abuse. We must remember that alcohol eventually leads to damage to the brain matter, what people sometimes colloquially term as wet brain, but it's really damage, severe damage called Wernicke's encephalopathy and Korsakoff psychosis, which is major damage to the memory areas, where patients really have areas of their memory which are totally blanked out, and they create stories to fit into that memory, and then they believe those stories. The prognosis for those patients are very, very poor, even in treatment for addiction treatment, and they usually get relegated to state mental health facilities. Relationship impact, I think, is the biggest issue. So if you look at physical damage, yes, to the patient and to the caregiver. Mental damage, yes, the patient and the caregiver, but relationship impact is multi-generational. So alcohol is a common causative factor in domestic violence. And also the victims may also be more at risk due to cultural and linguistic barriers. For example, in South Africa, I mean, there are laws, wonderful laws, but the implementation of these laws are really a problem. For example, the prejudice within the police system is that if a male has to report domestic violence by a female, he's scoffed upon. And so they talk about gender-based violence, but the major area is looked at as woman violence, which is significant. But we come across a lot of men who are going through a lot of abuse themselves. Marital problems include infidelity, communication breakdown, financial difficulties, parent-child relationships, very important, very important. The frontal area of the brain has cells called mirror neurons. It's almost like when a little child is grown up in this home, it's almost a download, a prefrontal download from the parent to the child. And so there's a lot of learned behavior. For example, with cannabis, which is a gateway drug, and alcohol, etc. So the child starts developing these neurological patterns of the parent. And later on, when they use the alcohol and drug, it's almost the alcohol and drug becomes a soothing factor for this patient. Then there's social isolation, the withdrawal from friends and families, and stigma and shame, that may experience stigma and shame from their communities, and then that further exacerbates the relationship problems. The last one I'm talking about there under relationships is adverse childhood experiences. And this is very important. We're talking about the experiences of children in the first 7 to 10 years of life. We're not talking when they're older. And so we do an ACE score. And under the ACE score, we look at where is there neglect? Is there emotional and physical neglect? Now, people sometimes don't know what neglect means. If I have fear, I grew up in a home and I have fear, and I haven't got the ability to express the fear because it is denied. That is emotional neglect. Physical neglect when you do not have, of course, food, water, and shelter. Then we look at abuse. Is there physical abuse? Is there emotional abuse? Or is there sexual abuse? And sexual abuse is really a massive, massive problem within the family. Sexual abuse to little children. Also, the exposure of children to pornography when they're very young. That's also sexual abuse. And then we look at what is the household dysfunction. Is there anyone in the home with a mental health problem? Anyone been incarcerated? Was there any divorce or separation? Is there any substance abuse? And a notable one, is there violence against the mother? And this violence is not just physical now, we're talking physical or emotional violence towards the mother. And this is really, so if you look at what I spoke about, these 10 factors would determine your adverse childhood experience score. Now, why this is so important, the patient may present with substance use disorder or alcohol use disorder at treatment facility. But if you just counsel and you don't rewire, don't really go down to the root and redevelop this person is also at risk for all the other NCDs, which is the non-communicable diseases. So it does not cause diabetes, but it actually worsens diabetes and it worsens the management. So there's the concept of epigenetics, which means that you may have a gene, but if the gene is exposed to adverse childhood experiences, it has what we call methyl groups that attach to the gene and changes the structure of the gene and create new proteins and put these patients more at risk for developing these unmanageable chronic conditions. So what are the barriers to accessing treatment? What are the types of treatment and the importance of culturally sensitive approaches? So the barriers are stigma, the lack of culturally appropriate services, which means people who understand a lot of the programs are Western based and people don't understand the culture of the Indian culture. Language barriers, a lot of patients may not really speak English fluently, and that may be making it difficult to access treatment services. There's a lack of awareness. Some may not be aware of the signs and symptoms of alcohol abuse. A lot of families where they drink, they think it's normal. Actually, you hear of patients reporting who complete treatment and go back home and speak to their families about stopping, and people will ask them, so what's wrong with you? You know, it's almost like if you're not drinking, there's something wrong with you. So it tells you a lot about the viewpoint. And then a lot of people have, of course, religious and spiritual beliefs that they may prefer to seek treatment through religious or spiritual channels rather than traditional medical approaches. Then there's financial constraints. Some may not have access to affordable alcohol abuse treatment. In South Africa, in the private sector, we've been involved in 1997 to 1999 in being able to change the Medical Schemes Act and allow people to have what we call PMBs, prescribed minimum benefits, within their health plan to cover any substance abuse issues. But of course, I mean, that is not the majority of the country. It's just people who are in the private sector who may be on a medical fund. There are government facilities that may not be best trained or best equipped, but there is access to treatment. And immigration statements. Some people are obviously in the country illicitly, and they would obviously not want to expose themselves by going into treatment. And yeah, so if we look at what are the traditional treatments available, obviously there's traditional healers, a lot of Ayurvedic practitioners, the spiritual leaders may be consulted to help with alcohol abuse. Some may offer herbs and dietary recommendations or other natural remedies to support recovery. There's a traditional counseling and therapy paradigm, which is more Western paradigm, including individual and group therapy. Then there's 12-step programs, as Dr. Nadesan was talking about. such as Alcoholics Anonymous, which are, of course, supportive community of peer and structured approach. Then there's medication-assisted treatment. Then there's formal detoxification and inpatient treatment. And then there's family-based interventions, which I think is very crucial, because I really believe that this is not the condition of just a person. It is a family condition. And, you know, it's said that each person who has an alcohol abuse problem affects about 16 other people. And when it comes to that, I just want to make this one point. We look particularly at a person with an alcohol use disorder. And if you really get to know this person, you will agree with me that a lot of them are very well skilled, and a lot of them are very intelligent, and they're very good friends, but they have real problems when it comes to emotional regulation, and they have real problems when it comes to intimate relationships. And I think, you know, if that's missed in treatment, in developing those areas, then we're going to have people who come into treatment to develop knowledge, and the basis is not intellectual and it's not knowledge. Because you would also agree that a lot of people with a drinking problem offer good advice to people who also have a drinking problem. So really, I think a thorough understanding is so important of what interventions are. So what's the importance of culturally sensitive approaches? I mean,
Dr. Naidu,
yes.
would you make your closing comments, please?
Okay, couple of minutes. Let's finish it now. Okay, so there's some cultural competence in healthcare providers. Language services need to be looked at. Incorporation of traditional practices need to be looked at. Family involvement, addressing stigma, and collaboration with community organizations. And I think that's very important that they get involved. I did a little case study, but just to tell you, in South Africa, it's about 43% men compared to 15% current alcohol use. Hazardous use about 10% in male. There's a legacy of apartheid issues, which got communities to live in little areas, and there was a lot of intermarriages, etc. And there's as limited research. Basically, there is a big organization called Sakendu, but it doesn't look at the broad community and the specific community. So the conclusion: we have a need for culturally sensitive prevention treatment options. We need to create efforts within the community to decrease stigma. We need to understand the role of gender, the importance of promoting healthy social norms, provide resources for people who may feel isolated. And we need to address the root cause of stress and social exclusion and reduce reliance on alcoholism. It's important to consider the role of availability and affordability, build good support networks, promote healthy communication and conflict resolution skills, and address social pressures. I just got a few references, but thank you so much for giving me this time, and I will be available for questions.
Excellent. Dr. Naidu, that was a very comprehensive presentation, and we really appreciate all that you've shared. So please do stick around for that Q&A. I'm sure we have a lot of questions for you.
No,
Thank you so much.
no problem.
Ladies and gentlemen, let me introduce our fourth and final speaker, and this is Professor Rohan Maharaj of Trinidad and Tobago. He's an alcohol policy advisor of the Healthy Caribbean Coalition and co-founder of the Caribbean Alcohol Reduction Day, held annually in November or December for the past 7 years. Welcome, Professor Maharaj. You have 20 minutes. Go ahead, please.
Thank you. I hope you can hear me well.
Yes, we are. Thank you.
So first of all, I'd just like to thank everyone for being here. I think it's good afternoon, good evening, and good morning, wherever you are from around the world. And I want to thank Dr. Kumar Mahabir and Shalima Mohammed and the Indo-Caribbean Cultural Center for inviting me to give this presentation. I'm going to briefly cover four areas. First, alcohol genetics in the South Asians. And this has been alluded to already. And I'll add a little more depth and show you where some of our concerns are. Then I'm going to share with you a study that I was involved with in Trinidad, looking at alcohol use in households and the impact on individuals and families in Trinidad. Show you one slide just to show you how challenges it is in terms of the sort of media presence of alcohol. And then conclude by looking at some of our regional policies with regard to susceptible populations in the region. So I always like to start, make it personal and tell a little story. Because when you start to talk numbers, sometimes we lose sight of the human component of alcohol. So JM was a South Asian male who experienced an occasional pain in the right back, just below and inside the scapula. It was a persistent, irritative pain that resolved with paracetamol. And thinking back in the years I knew him, he used paracetamol quite regularly. I'd never seen him drunk, but many of his friends and co-workers were drinkers. He worked at the port in Trinidad at a time when the oil boom was taking off. And every Christmas, many of the workers were rewarded very generously with alcohol by the people who were doing the transportation and so on the wharves. He died at the age of 72 from liver failure. And recently, I have been having, if I have alcohol, I get pain in the same spot. And this gentleman, JM, was my father. So I've learned not to take Panadols when I get this pain, and to start thinking a little bit carefully about how I use alcohol myself. So this has been alluded to, but I thought it'd be good for us to just understand a little bit about the genetics of alcohol. And alcohol is not naturally occurring in the human body. And so if alcohol is ingested, it has to be broken down. And it's broken down through something called alcohol dehydrogenase, which is ADH on top here. Can you see my cursor? Yeah. And when it's broken down, it creates something called acetaldehyde. Acetaldehyde is then broken down through something called acetaldehyde dehydrogenase to acetate. The problem is, and as we see in a minute, is that if you have something called gene polymorphism, right, where you have a change in the genetic makeup through any of these enzymes, these are the enzymes that break down alcohol, either the alcohol dehydrogenase H1B or aldehyde dehydrogenase H2, or something called GSTMM1 and GSTT1. What you get is when you have this present, you get the buildup of something called ROS, which are reactive oxygen substances. And as these increase, they cause your DNA to become bulky. It breaks down your protein, causes DNA damage, and leads to alcoholic liver disease and carcinoma. And in this other component of the slide here, you see something called CYP. These are some of the enzymes available in the liver, which also use the breakdown some of the metabolites of tobacco to again create this ROS. These ROS are very toxic substances. And alcohol dehydrogenase has been recognized as a challenge in the Asian population. In studies of various aldehyde dehydrogenase isoenzymes have found that whites have two predominant isoenzymes, and these isoenzymes are present in 100% of people who are white population. However, when they test the Asian subjects, I must tell you, this was done more in the East Asian, so we're talking Japanese, Chinese, and so on, that population, about 50% of this population had a change in the aldehyde dehydrogenase enzymes. And we know that some Asians have this experience of this thing called a flushing, where they drink alcohol and they get extremely red and their blood pressure drops. And so this aldehyde dehydrogenase isoenzyme change in the allele, this gene polymorphism, is associated with illness in the East Asians. Now, genetic studies of South Asian populations tell a very similar type story. And what you see here are several studies done since 2006. So a couple have been done right here in Trinidad. So one by Montaigne Jaime, which is one of my colleagues at UWI St. Augustine. And they found that the alcohol dehydrogenase allele, which is the genetic polymorphism that I was talking about, was significantly associated with alcohol dependence overall, and especially within the Indo-Trinidadian ancestry. they found that GGT levels, which is a measure of the liver enzymes, were also found to be elevated within the Indo population when you had an alcohol dehydrogenase allele, which is a genetic polymorphism. It's not the usual gene that's present. As part of that same team, more in 2007, again looking at Indo-Trinidadian populations, they found that participants with one of these aldehyde dehydrogenase alleles were more likely to have a lifetime diagnosis of alcohol dependence. And participants with the aldehyde dehydrogenase allele also reported significantly higher levels of current alcohol consumptions. And similar types of studies have been also found, been published from Baswani, Datta, and Mansouri, looking at Indian populations, some from North India, some from Central India. So we seem to suggest, what this data is suggesting is that there is some sort of genetic polymorphism. So that part of the problem with the South Asian population, this is where we're talking to people from the Indian subcontinent, seems to have a genetic predisposition to disease associated with alcohol intake, right? Two studies coming out of the UK by Clark and Wickramasinghe suggest that if you compare South Asians, people from the Indian subcontinent, with people of Europeans who report drinking roughly the same amount of alcohol, what you see is that in the South Asian, there's greater liver damage to the presence of this enzyme called GGT and changes in the red cells themselves. They get something called macrocytosis. So what we're seeing is that for same amounts of alcohol, the South Asian is being affected more, and there seems to be a genetic predisposition to both liver damage for acetaldehyde metabolism and impaired alcohol dehydrogenase mechanisms. Now, I think that this is really important for us to remember that since 2007, the International Agency for Research on Cancer, which is a subunit of the World Health Organization, has reported that alcohol and its metabolite acetaldehyde, those two parts of that equation I first showed you, have been classified as group 1 human carcinogens due to the acetaldehyde's reactivity and genotoxicity to DNA. So it actually damages the DNA, the protein, and the macromolecules. And as alluded to by a previous speaker, that many epidemiologic studies have now demonstrated that alcohol is causally related to malignant tumors of the mouth, the pharynx, the larynx, the esophagus, the breast, the female breast, the liver, and the colorectal. And East Indians who carry this acetaldehyde dehydrogenase variant at higher risk for esophageal, head and neck, lung cancer, if they regularly consume alcohol compared to people with this wild type acetaldehyde dehydrogenase, which seems to be much more effective in breaking down acetaldehyde. Okay, so that's the first part of this talk, which basically sets the picture that says the people of South Asian descent seem to be more at risk for damage from alcohol because of our metabolism, because of the absence of certain enzymes, and the fact that some of these enzymes don't work as well as they should. So in 2015 between 2015 and 2017, we did a large national alcohol survey of households of Trinidad and Tobago, looking at we actually visited about 1,800 households spread out in a random sample of enumeration districts throughout the country. In our first slide, which is in table 1, what I want you to see is, in terms of alcohol use, about two-thirds of our households reported alcohol use. Households that were led by Afro-Trinidadians, about 40%, East Indians, about 30%, and mixed ethnicity, about 30%. So this is very much in keeping with sort of ethnic breakdown in the country. And we saw that the households are roughly equally using alcohol, and overall, about two-thirds of households reported the use of alcohol. But when you look and you broke that down now into households that use alcohol, so table 4 at the bottom is telling us, if you look at heavy episodic drinking, so the column on the left, you'll see here, no heavy episodic drinking. versus heavy episodic drinking. So heavy episodic drinking is someone in the household using 5 or 6 drinks per day, per session. What you see is that we tend to now see the Afro population being less represented in the group that's using alcohol in a heavy episodic way. So roughly all 2/3 of households in Trinidad use alcohol. But when we look at the households that use alcohol in a dangerous way, we see the mixed and the ethnic East Indian populations using heavy episodic drinking more. So that is something we need to think about when we think about how alcohol affects the Indo population in Trinidad. We then went on to explore what was the impact of this alcohol use on the households. And what you found is that where there was heavy episodic drinking, there are greater chances of lifestyle-related illnesses, of relationship problems between partners, strained relationships within the household, and infidelity between spouses or partners, and being in trouble with the law through receiving a traffic ticket. So there are impacts. We were able to demonstrate that in households where there's heavy episodic drinking, there's a definite impact on the household itself. Right? So that's a little bit about what information we have about the use of alcohol in the Indo population. And then just to remind us, of the really powerful impact of media. So this tells us about a little bit about how alcohol is promoted. First, down at the bottom here, that alcohol can be sold at our bars on an any day, any time basis. That we have a lot of our young performers endorsing alcohol, and the House of Angostura, which is world famous for bitters formation, also has a heavy rum production. And they were using the entertainment industry as part of their collaboration. And we see it being manifested in a series of songs in the chutney soca genre in Trinidad and in the soca genre. And then, of course, the link to carnival. We know that alcohol is promoted in the carnival setting in Trinidad, which carnival is one of our things that Trinidad is most well known for, right? And this was some slides that we had created as part of how during the COVID epidemic, a lot of the alcohol industry targeted women online. So there's a huge media presence that makes it difficult for young people to sort of evade the effects of alcohol advertising. And then this slide here now, it's a little bit busy, but I want to break it down into the green, the red, and the orange. And this is looking at our programs across the Caribbean region, looking at what sort of policies are being undertaken by our government. So we see that 90% of our governments have bought into the idea of excise taxes. 92% have claimed to support community action. About 67% talk about legal blood alcohol concentration for when you're driving a vehicle, have a minimum age for on-premises and off-premises sales, about 50%, right? And about 50% have national monitoring system. Where we feel terribly in the Caribbean is on legally binding regulations on alcohol advertising, having a national action plan, legally binding regulations on alcohol sponsorship and sales promotion, and on health labels on our alcohol containers. Now, those marked with the asterisks are what we call the WHO best buys. They are the things that WHO says that if a government does this, it is cost effective and is easily acceptable by your country. And as you notice here, 3 of the things that the WHO best buys, we're not really instituting within the Caribbean region. So 2 things that are happening right now that I want you to look out for. One is that we have our Pan-Caribbean Conference on the harmful use of alcohol. We hope to have this ready for December 2023. So if you live in the region, we hope to have it online. So we hope that you will think about attending this. And one of the really amazing things that happened in the last couple of years is the declaration of the World Health Organization towards a global alcohol action plan. And this action plan is a political declaration of the General Assembly. And what we're hoping is that this will now provide an impetus, a launching point, if it will, for governments taking a more active role in looking and working on alcohol as a danger to public and the public good. Right? So in conclusion, then, there's a strong genetic basis for alcohol harm in the South Asian population. It's not completely elucidated, and there's a lot of space for us to do a lot more work in this area. We see that there's heavy episodic consumption in the South Asian and mixed ethnicities population in Trinidad, and that consumption leads to challenges within the home. There's strong media presence of alcohol in the music and the carnival, driving a lot of life choices and behaviors, especially among our young people. And there's limited national policy formulation in the English-speaking Caribbean, especially around the marketing of alcohol. And as we see, we have a high-risk population that can't handle alcohol because of its genetic makeup. And we should be doing more to protect these populations in terms of education and so on. So thank you for coming. Thank you. Share this with your family and friends and community. You may save a life. And I thank you for your attention.
An excellent presentation, Sid.
Thank you.
Really well researched, and we appreciate the information so much. Please do keep us posted on that conference, the Pan-Caribbean Conference on the Harmful Use of Alcohol, and we would be very happy to share the details with our audience. So as soon as you have those details, please do send it to us.
Thank you.
Thank you. So ladies and gentlemen, I want to thank Professor Maharaj once again, as well as our three other speakers for their time, their effort, and their expertise. I just want to remind everyone this meeting is being recorded live and would be uploaded later after editing on YouTube permanently for posterity. So if you've missed any details or you want to look at it again, it will be available to you. We are currently live streaming on the YouTube channel of the Indo-Caribbean Cultural Center, and I want to say hello and welcome to all of you all who are on YouTube right now. For those of you here with us on Zoom, if you have a question or a comment, I'll open the floor now. Please raise your electronic hand, which is in the reactions button at the base of your screen. Our IT manager, Robin Ramsing, will allow you to speak, and you can ask your question then. So I'm seeing Dr. Mahaber with his hand up first and foremost. Welcome, go ahead.
Okay, I just have a question on the case, but any one of the panelists can answer. With respect to alcohol use or abuse or alcoholism, whatever you call it, how do you compare Indians in the diaspora in Trinidad with Indians in India? Can you make a comparison, please?
I think Mr. Naidu had alluded to some facts from India. Mr. Naidu, would you be able to respond to that question?
Yeah, okay. So if you look at research, there's not much research, and the research is very varied. But if you look at India with alcohol use problems, we get in a cohort of 1 in 12, which is like 8%, compared to South Africa, which you're looking at hazardous drinking of 10%, but recent drinking of about 43%. So I think it's higher in the diaspora.
Okay, thank you for that response. Any other speaker would like to respond to that?
So I think if we look at it genetically, there seems to be so if you look at the studies that we have so far, whether it's done in Trinidad, Central India, or Northern India, there seems to be something happening with the genetics, our ability to metabolize this foreign substance, as it were. And so far, the data tells us there's something a little bit different. We haven't had one single enzyme showing up across all the ethnic subgroups. So I think that if it is that we have to say something, I would say that South Asians in general are more susceptible to the harmful effects of alcohol. And don't worry too much about the numbers. The numbers may be cultural, it may be situational, it may be issues with regards to, you know, the situation that we find ourselves in a particular time. I think we really need to keep stressing the point that we are more vulnerable and therefore we need to be more careful. We need to educate our populations about the potential because we're made differently. And I think that's something that I don't hear enough of. And it's there, and we need to inform our populations. If nobody else is doing it for us, we need to do it for ourselves.
Yeah, very good point. Thank you. Mr. Embal Mohini, welcome. You can unmute and ask your question. You should be able to unmute yourself.
Okay, I think I'm on mute now.
Yes, go ahead.
Okay, two things I wanted to look at. Well, first would be more from a community standpoint, because I know that at a very tender age, individuals are influenced from within the home. Okay, for example, within my home, my father used to say, he's not going to drink, he's not going to smoke, he's not going to do anything that is harmful. So that I grew with that within my mind. So I think that whether through community effort, something could be done to get to reach homes and communities at so that the young persons at a very tender age would go with a particular orientation. The other aspect of it is from a government standpoint, whether governments can be lobbied to, even if they don't stop alcohol advertising, but whether we can look at the time periods when younger persons, students, etc., would be more exposed to advertising, whether it's television, radio, what have you, and limit advertising during those time periods. Because I know that companies would think that they have invested a lot in their agriculture, and they wouldn't, not agriculture, alcohol, and they wouldn't want to stop advertising altogether. But if we could possibly lobby the government to begin an initiative to possibly restrict the time periods in the day when alcohol could be advertised.
Yeah, very good suggestion, sir. Thank you very much for that. And I don't think it applies only to Trinidad and Tobago. Those suggestions should apply across the board throughout the diaspora. Thank you very much.
If I could respond for a second.
Sure.
Thank you very much, Mr. Wahidi, for your thoughts. The challenge we have with our young people is that you go online now and there's no control. So we now have to be concerned about cross-border advertising for alcohol, and it's rampant, I tell you. The young people are called upon to like a product, and if you like a product, you like it with other people, and then the social pressure is very intense. And you know, you see it now. If I tell you there is a green band with a red star on it, what comes to your mind, right? For most of us who watch soccer, there's only one thing, Heineken. And that's all you see, a green band with a red star. And Heineken now are selling zero alcohol products with the green band and the red star. And what happens is you are now, as a young person, associating this green band with a red star with your favorite football team. The first day you go to the pub, you see the green band with the red star. Ah, that's my team, I'm going to buy that. And it's very subtle, it's not overt. It's a very subtle pressure that's linked to things that, oh, I like this already. And that's why we, you know, asking our 14 individual governments in the Caribbean and all our diasporic governments to respond to this individually, you're going to have to go to 14 different parliaments. We need something bigger. And that's what, for those of us who work in global alcohol policy, we're looking towards this global alcohol action plan, which will put a little bit of pressure on our governments to think a little more carefully about how we look at alcohol, its harm, impact on societies. And I think that for us who have a genetic predisposition to more harmful effects, we need to be more vocal in how we sell our need for protection. I think that that's something that we don't do enough of. Thank you.
Yeah, and the commercial interests are going to railroad those efforts at some point too. Thank you. Dr. David Subran, go ahead, please. Dr. Subran, can you unmute?
Yes, I think I'm unmuted now.
Yes, yes. Go ahead.
First of all, what practical advice you can offer for an individual who wishes to end alcohol dependency? And secondly, it was mentioned earlier that it takes a village to raise a child. Now, maybe at that point in time, but I think today, especially in Trinidad and Tobago, that will be a risk. Thank you very much.
Yes, an interesting comment there. And question, Professor Nadesan, would you like to respond?
Thank you. Yes, with regards to the second point about taking a village to raise a child, this is an old adage that has been here since time immemorial, and I related it to when the immigrants came to South Africa. So Indian nationals came to South Africa, and that's the type of lifestyle that they had led at that time. With regards to your first question, and how does one then rid themselves of an addiction? And I think there's many support groups out there. There's the medical field and medical intervention that that Dr. Naidu will probably allude to. But from a social perspective and wanting to rid yourself of the addiction, I think reach out to groups like Alcoholics Anonymous. They have excellent 12-step programs. The thing is, one has to stick to the program in order for it to work. So AA has a program of sponsorship where it's one experienced recovered alcoholic speaking to the newcomer and guiding them through the 12-step process. And then you find that getting rid of or overcoming addiction is not an easy process. So sometimes one uses a combination of medical and outpatient treatment, and sometimes you use just the support group. So it actually depends on who, the resources that are available to you as well. And perhaps from a medical perspective, Lochan, if you want to address that, but I think you're the expert there.
Yeah, thank you very much for that question. I think I want to say that the person drinking alcohol who deems that he's got a problem tends to think that alcohol is the problem. And then my viewpoint, and this is not necessarily the medical viewpoint, my viewpoint is the patient has alcohol as a solution to some other problem. So I'll give you a simple example. If I can't dance because I have low self-esteem or I'm shy or whatever, I drink some alcohol and I can dance. So if I have the genetics, as Prof was speaking about, after a while, initially I can control it. After a while, I lose control of this. So there's some external pressure. Either I'm sick or there's some pressure legally or relationship-wise, or something makes me think that I need to stop drinking. So a lot of patients don't really want to stop drinking. Some of them eventually come to realize, I can't drink. If I have one, I need to have another. So they want to stop drinking. So some people think that alcohol is the problem, and then they want to stop drinking. But remember, why do people eventually continue using alcohol? Well, there's three reasons. One is they want to escape reality. They can't handle that reality. Two, they often deny or do not cater for their responsibilities. And once they get back to earth, once they come back to a sober sense, then they start denying consequences. And so there's this big idea of what we call cross addiction. So we see a lot of people who in their young days were drinking or drugging, who may have hurt the environment, the way their children grew up, and now that they're older, for whatever reason, stop drinking. Some people have a religious conversion, for example. Some people just get addicted to their work and continue working. So people are getting a high from somewhere else. So the outcome mustn't be stopping alcohol. So what I'm saying, each patient needs to have a proper assessment by someone who understands addiction. So if you do that, there are mechanisms to use. For example, what we call the Addiction Severity Index, which looks at the 7 or 8 different spheres of a person's life and how it's expanded, each of them can be expanded to be able to look at, is there an intervention that's necessary? And is the patient willing to come into inpatient, outpatient, etc.? People are at various, what we call, there's something called a stages of change model. People are at different stages of change. Some people just want to stop. So in summary, what I'm saying is, if someone desires to stop drinking, he needs to engage in the process of seeking help. Doesn't matter where he engages, whether he engages as outpatient, whether he engages inpatient, support system, etc. But he needs to attend to what his issues are. If a patient eventually is unable to stop at a level of a community-based program or at the level of an outpatient, that person should seek help from an appropriate facility or appropriate professional to be able to assess why is this. So it's like anything else. You go to your general practitioner, or you start for diabetics, they will go to a dietitian, they'll control their diet, and they find even though they control the diet, they can't control their diabetes. They go to the general practitioner who starts certain medication or something else, and they can't control that, and eventually will go to a specialist. So there are levels of care, levels of readiness for change, and different interventions. And simplistically saying, alcohol is my problem, I need to stop it, doesn't fix the patient. Yeah. The second issue is, this is a generational issue. So when patients get involved, it's also the family needs to get involved. So I think that's the best I can answer this question. But really, I think medication can be used in some people, but there's a caveat I want to warn against. And the caveat is this: if a patient doesn't go to the appropriate, for example, AA meetings or outpatient or to an addiction facility, a lot of these patients, because of their exposure to their doctors or whatever in society, end up going to a psychiatric facility. And unfortunately, in the psychiatric facility, people, if the psychiatrist is astute, they would be able to diagnose what we call dual diagnosis, which means a substance abuse problem and maybe a coexisting mental health problem. The problem is if they don't diagnose a substance abuse problem and they just call the substance abuse problem another problem, which is a psychiatric problem. So you'll find patients who are on chronic medication for psychiatric medication, for psychiatric conditions, who are also continuing their alcohol and drugs. So I think within the helping professionals and non-professionals that support the community-based issue, what is lacking is an interaction and a collaboration between all these energies. So it's almost like we need to be able to create a coming together of minds and a reduction of ego and competition when it comes to what are the interventions available. That not every intervention can help everyone. The outcome that each person wants is important. And the third issue is keep the person engaged at whatever level. Keep him engaged, keep the family engaged in the therapeutic milieu. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Naidu. Very, very complete response there. You all, we have just about 2 minutes left. And so I would like to just ask Mr. Ramnaresh Dwarka to make his contribution. Can you unmute, please? You're still muted. Just unmute your mic, please.
Yes, I
Yes.
think I got it here, finally.
Yes.
I just want to say that, way back in 1979, I was part of a research group looking at alcohol treatment center in Trinidad. And 73% of the admissions there were East Indians from County Caroni and County Victoria. And being an Indian myself, I wanted to know, why Indians drinking so much rum? Well, of course, Professor Rohan gave us an ample explanation, from the research and all of that. However, while genetic factors, I think, is especially important for us in the Indian diaspora, genetic factors cut across the board for all the other ethnicities as well. We know now that there's a genetic predisposition to drug addiction. However, I will later on, as a resource person for the Caribbean Institute on Alcoholism and Drug Addiction, I did another paper looking at drinking and drug practices among the East Indian population in Trinidad and Tobago. And it was interesting to look at, by comparison, and I'm glad that we had the person from Mauritius here, because in Mauritius, the Indian population is in the majority. And they found that in those days, at that time, the heavy incidence of alcoholism were among the Afro-Mauritian, as indeed among the North American Indians. You had a high incidence as well. There was also a high incidence among the Irish, the people there. And what seemed to be coming out there is more socioeconomic conditions. And I think that is something that we identified with the indentureship and all of that. And I think we need to look a little bit more about that. Yes, it is important to look at the genetic, that is important, the social factors, but the socioeconomic factors, I think, also give some insight into why East Indians, like other minority groups, peripheral groups, were now using alcohol, as it were, to help them to cope with their life situations. I just wanted to make that comment.
All right, thank you very much. So the nature-nurture debate continues. Yeah, it's very, very topical. Thank you. Mr. Ramnarayan Sahadev, we'll take you. Go ahead, please. You'd want to unmute your mic? Go ahead, please.
Namaste.
Namaste.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, this is an excellent presentation, because I think this problem is extremely serious. We can discuss a lot, but we have to look for solutions. We know the problems. A question has been asked about India. I went to India and because of my fascination with Gandhi, and in the state of Gujarat, it's called a dry state. This was a state that had serious alcoholism before Gandhi took up the project. Now you can't, you have to get special permission to drink there. We talk about individuals and government rules. The serious problem is with most of us lack courage to deal with this issue. How many of us, for example, would get invitation to a wedding or any other social function and reply saying, look, I hope, I wish you the best, but because alcohol will be present, I will be sending your gift in the mail or by some other means, but I will not be there. How many of us are willing to tell politicians that we are not coming to your event if alcohol is present? This is courage from the individual that we're lacking. This is a season of fasting. We're doing without food. We're doing, it's Lent, it's Ramadan, it's Nowrat. We can do these things because somehow or the other, we believe it's connected to spirituality. Look, the human family is a cornerstone of society. if we destroy that, we destroy the whole society. It's a serious problem. In Gujarat, the social pressure is exercised by the people. If I'm looking for somebody to marry and that other family consumes alcohol, the marriage is off. In Guyana, I wrote a long article on this subject, which can be made available. After a priest was killed by some drunks early in the morning, he was asking them just to stop making noise in front of his house. I really think some of us are passing the buck here, and we have to start individually to deal with this problem. Take care. Thanks.
Take your point, sir. Thank you very much. We had Mr. Sandeep Singh with his hand up previously. Mr. Singh, please go ahead. And this will be our last question for the evening. Mr. Sandeep Singh.
Thank you. Can you hear me now?
Yes, we're hearing you.
Thank you. Thank you to the presenters for this excellent topic. My question is, I think the first one is to be to Dr. Naidu. We have a situation where we see many people who are alcoholics. As Dr. Naidu rightfully commented, many of them are educated, they're friendly. But the problem that I find is that, especially even here with close family, is to convince them that they are alcoholics. They are in denial, and it is difficult in which to have them put into the that Dr. Naidu. How does one go about expressing the concern for these people and getting them into these centers so that they receive proper treatment? The second question, and I think Dr. Maraj has tapped on this, is that I think he indicated that when somebody drinks 5 or 6 drinks a day, but my concern is that where you have a person who is, say, addicted to having his 2 drinks a night, would you term him an alcoholic? Thanks, Halima.
Okay, you're welcome. Gentlemen, may I please ask, given the time, would you just please hold your responses for a few seconds? We need to bring today's program to a close, and that will be the live stream and so on. However, we will take your responses off air if you don't mind.
No problem.
Thank you. Very important question that you raised, sir. And at this point in time, let me just thank each of our speakers for being here with us today. Dr. Verena Tandre Ragbar from Mauritius, Dr. Varoshni Nadesan from South Africa, Dr. Locha Naidu from South Africa, and Professor Rohan Maharaj from Trinidad. Exceptional presentations, and we really want to thank you. So I'll turn you over now to Shakira, the chair.
Thank you, Shalama, for being a wonderful moderator. And we want to thank all our speakers for this wonderful topic and their fantastic presentations. As we've said before, the public meeting is being hosted by the Indo-Caribbean Cultural Center and the Amina Gafur Institute for the Study of Indentureship and its Legacies, led by Professor David Davidine. So we want to thank also our IT manager behind the scenes, Robin Ramsing, who has been recording the program and will edit and upload it to our website and to YouTube permanently for posterity. Our topic next Sunday will be Conversations with Indian Elders, Part 8. Please visit our YouTube channel to see all of our past recordings. I am Shakira Mohammed of Trinidad and Tobago saying goodbye. May God bless you all. Dhanyabad.
So yeah, we can have a